Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you so much to all of you who have come here tonight to share this with me. It's rare that someone gets a chance to have this kind of venue to talk with your colleagues about your scholarship, and I really appreciate that you all are here with me tonight, so thank you. So what I'm going to do this evening is talk a little bit about my identity as a scholar, and then give you just a snippet, a piece of my project on solidarity ethics as a way of introducing you to my work. So I would start by saying that I identify myself as a feminist Christian social ethicist. And some of you probably know exactly what that means and why it's important for me to clarify my identity and positionality at the beginning of this talk. Others of you probably know what each of those words mean: feminist, Christian, social, ethicist, but have no idea why anyone would put them all together and what that means. So my task tonight is to offer some framing remarks about my methodological and intellectual traditions, and then to share some remarks about my project. So I'm going to start with a very dense definition of my work and then unpack it. My work as a Christian social ethicist is best defined as feminist liberation ethics, a strand of thought rooted in the tradition of social Christianity that takes the problem of social injustice as its starting point. By its very nature, Christian social ethics is public theology that engages in critical social analysis with an eye toward developing normative moral criteria to help shape human behavior and social policy. My work is also informed by critical feminist theologies that shape my work in several significant ways, including an emphasis on examining interstructured oppression, privileging standpoint theory and the importance of social location, and making my work accessible both to people inside and outside the academy. These trajectories of feminism and social Christianity are the heresy and justice of my title, and they are both parts of the legacy of social Christianity and prophetic traditions. So let's begin with the heresy. Feminist theology began in the late 60s and early 70s as feminists who were also Christian began to question the patriarchal traditions and practices of Protestant and Roman Catholic theology and ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is that which has to do with the church, so the study of the church or church structures. Foundational to feminist methodologies and theologies is expanding the traditional sources of theology, which primarily emphasize scripture and tradition with a nod toward reason and experience, but expanding those to focus more critically on how women's experience influences and shapes human knowledge of the divine, as well as traditional theological and ecclesial categories. A classic example of this is Valerie Saving's challenge to the traditional Christian understanding of sin as pride, represented by Reinhold Niebuhr. In 1960, Saving famously argued, while it may be true that men's greatest sin is pride, most women, particularly in 1960, were not guilty of too much pride, but rather of an underdevelopment or negation of the self. While feminist theological concerns were primarily focused on issues of recognizing women's equality and dignity before God and in the church in the early days, concerns quickly shifted to analyzing patriarchal power, privilege, and access, not only within Christian traditions, but also how patriarchal powers that shaped societies were often rooted in religious teachings and traditions as well. Christian ethicist Beverly Harrison noted the importance of the work of feminist theology to feminism more broadly when she noted, unless the presuppositions of patriarchy pervasive in the major world religions were exposed, male supremacy could never be ended effectively. There were also women who recognized the intersections between various forms of oppression and redefined a feminist understanding of justice to include all those whose voices are marginalized and excluded from systems of power and authority. Feminist theological visions of the church and the world that seek to subvert traditional theologies that have oppressed and damaged women, people of color, the poor, LGBTQI people, and others who stand on the margins of society have also functioned to expand the methodology and task of feminist theologies beyond simply the liberation and equality of women to issues and questions of justice for all who are marginalized by power and authority. Various conservative, fundamentalist, and traditional Christians have invoked stereotypes and misinformation about feminist theologies in an effort to portray them as forms of heresy and witchcraft that threaten the core fundamentals of Christianity. This accusation of heresy has frequently been levied against feminist theologians for exploring female images and embodiments of the divine, for challenging patriarchal traditions and categories that are rooted in tradition, and for engaging in creative theological discourse that seeks to reimagine Christianity and the divine. Ultimately, the reason that feminism and feminist theology is so vilified is because theology and ethics are so intimately related. Feminist theologies offer not only a different understanding of God, but also a different image of the world. Namely, the ways that one thinks about the divine and their relationship to the divine shapes how people live in the world, and it impacts their ethical decision-making. For example, if a Christian believes that God approves only of sex within marriage, then that affects their behavior in one of several ways. One does not have non-marital sex. One has non-marital sex and feels guilty and alienated from God. One thinks that such a God does not make sense in a world where non-marital sex is a positive aspect of life, and thus they reject God. Or one experiences God's presence and love in the context of intimate relationships, which helps them to rethink their relationship to God and their theology. This last example of an expansive theological vision of God as affirming of loving, caring, and justice-oriented intimate relationships represents the kind of theological shift that feminist theologians and ethicists embody in our work. And it's a fear of these kinds of theological shifts and their implications for the church and the world that lie at the heart of that charge of heresy. So let's move on to justice, my favorite topic. Over the last 100 years, Christian ethics has offered two pathways for addressing problems of social injustice: prophetic and pragmatic. While the prophetic tradition traces its history back to the Hebrew prophets, it has more recently been associated with the social gospel movement and liberation theology. The tradition of pragmatism is more closely associated with the mid-20th century movement of Christian realism. As we delve into these two trajectories of Christian ethics a bit more deeply, let's begin in 1886 in the heart of Hell's Kitchen, a poverty-stricken, dangerous industrial area of New York City, where Walter Rauschenbusch began his ministry. At that time, Hell's Kitchen was home to a large population of poor and working-class immigrants, and Rauschenbusch's church was largely made up of German-speaking immigrants. Later in his life, Rauschenbusch remarked that when he went to New York, quote, "My idea was to save souls. I had no idea of social questions," end quote. But it was the social questions that confronted him, as he found himself ministering to a congregation of desperately poor parishioners squeezed into overcrowded tenement housing and struggling with malnutrition and oppressive working conditions. Rauschenbusch's idealistic convictions about the redemptive power of the person and teachings of Christ to regenerate individuals fell short in the face of the social reality of the life of the poor in the midst of unrestrained capitalism. Rauschenbusch became part of a disparate group of progressive Christians who were appalled by the ways in which the engines of capitalism were attacking and destroying the fabric of the human community through the relentless drive for increased production and wealth accumulation. These theologians, preachers, and church leaders were at the forefront of an important theological movement that called Christians to respond to the social crisis of their age with a transformative new theology known as the social gospel. This movement responded to the injustice and social inequality that had resulted from the Industrial Revolution and the urbanization of American culture by fighting for living wages, worker safety, abolishing child labor, and instituting a shorter work week. Rauschenbusch, who became the leading voice of the movement, identified the social gospel with a radical social and cultural transformation that would bring about a social order in harmony with the life and teachings of Jesus. Now, the political and moral evil of 2 world wars ultimately led a new generation of theologians to reject the theology of the social gospel. One of the most influential theologians of the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr, shared the social gospelers' emphasis on love as the starting point of Christian ethics. However, Niebuhr's understanding of love was tempered by a theological anthropology that emphasized the sinful nature of the human condition and led him to reject the optimistic agenda of the social gospel to usher in the kingdom of heaven on earth as utopian and politically naive. Niebuhr believed that the presence of human sin, remember Saving's argument, Niebuhr was the one who said sin is pride. So Niebuhr believed that the presence of human sin required the compromise of idealistic moral positions in ways that allowed for and enabled human action and progress on social problems. So this led to the development of a more pragmatic approach to social ethics known as Christian realism. Niebuhr was interested in social ethics and theology that had the capacity to make real social change to improve the lives of people. This pragmatism led to the development of a model of Christian ethics centered around what are known as middle axioms, which involved the articulation of moral principles that ought to guide social action and policy in the political sphere. While Reinhold Niebuhr's loss of idealism and shift to realism was a radical break with the perceived utopianism of the social gospelers, his Christian realist approach reflected a pragmatic shift in strategy for how to achieve social change that nonetheless retained the social gospel commitment to shaping the social structures of society towards justice. Then in the 1960s, theologians from the developing world and from marginalized communities in the first world developed another new theological movement known as liberation theology, which takes God's act of liberating the slaves from Egypt as the starting point for thinking about God, salvation, and God's desire for life on earth. The prophetic vision of liberation from oppression and injustice that became the rallying cry of the movement harkened back to that progressive vision of Christianity promoted by the social gospelers. In the early 70s, the tension between the Christian realists who denounced the liberationists, again as naive and utopian like the social gospelers, was in conflict with the liberation theologians who charged the realists with being establishment theologians. So while it may be hard for some to imagine how truly revolutionary the idea of social Christianity was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, prominent Christian ethicist Gary Dorian argues that the idea that Christianity has a social mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of equality, freedom, and community was something new in Christian history. As a feminist, Christian social ethicist, I seek to navigate the delicate territory between pragmatism and prophetic vision in my work. All of these movements are part of this tradition of social Christianity within Protestantism that began with the social gospel movement. This tradition focuses on embodying social justice by working for the democratization of economic and social power in the world. My current work on solidarity ethics seeks to incorporate insights from all three of these significant theological movements that have shaped faith and life in the United States for the last 100 years. From a pragmatic perspective, it is true that a shift from neoliberal capitalism, which dominates the world today, to a more just economic model appears to be a utopian vision. Some might say an impossibility, given the political economic structures of our day. However, prophetic vision plays an important role in society by allowing people to imagine what a world could be like. Even if it is practically unlikely, the vision offers something to strive toward that calls people beyond the present reality that they know and towards a better future. At the same time, any justice ethic that is also shaped by realism must recognize and acknowledge the devastation and destruction that humans have waged on one another. Seeking to understand war, terrorism, racism, prejudice, or any other form of personal or systemic violence can help people gain insight into the ways in which human behavior and attitudes contribute to the persistence of evil in the world. Possessing a deeper knowledge of human nature and human sin offers a more realistic foundation for developing strategies for social change that might be effective in establishing economic and political structures that promote peace and stability in the world. Inspired by hope, a Christian ethic of solidarity can learn from the ways in which humans have stood together to fight against oppression and offer strategies for building a more just world. Having a goal can encourage people to move forward while also helping to guide them on the way. The transformation of social structures of society toward justice is an intrinsic part of what it means to be Christian, which is central to each of these theologies, that has become the central aspect of this broader Christian tradition of social Christianity that continues to this day. So I'd like to shift now and turn and talk a little bit about my work on solidarity ethics. So this work is a response to the moral dilemma that living in the first world poses for people who are concerned about global justice. The social injustice that is generated by the dominant form of economic globalization in our world is fueled by an economic ideology that privileges individualism, self-interest, and wealth accumulation. While many people in the first world have begun to develop a heightened consciousness about poverty and injustice and the inequality that plagues our world, too many people feel powerless to effect any real change. Global justice requires the creation of long-term social change that holds the possibility of improving life and the circumstances for life for not only present generations, but for future generations as well. However, mobilizing citizens of the global north to work for long-term social change is a uniquely difficult problem for at least three reasons. One, first world citizens benefit from the current system. Two, people, especially in the US and the first world, have been conditioned to respond with charity rather than justice. And three, first world citizens often have an emotional and even a physical distance from injustice. These three factors contribute to the larger social problem that confronts prospects for global justice. Simply the lack of political will to make the long-term social changes that are necessary to attend to the social well-being of people and care for the planet. So my current project focuses on developing an ethic of solidarity as a strategy for engaging first world Christians in behaviors that hold the possibility of shaping political will towards addressing global justice in meaningful ways. This ethic of solidarity is a transformative ethic, rooted in the principles of sustainability and social justice that requires first world citizens to work simultaneously on transforming our personal habits and lifestyles, as well as addressing global economic and political structure. So you have to do both simultaneously. We have to change ourselves and we have to change the structures of society. Embracing an ethic of solidarity addresses the three impediments to political will by asking people to acknowledge the ways in which privilege shapes their lives, and by challenging people to develop relationships of solidarity with people who suffer from injustice, and to work together on long-term projects of social change. So I'm only going to focus on one key aspect of this argument in the time that remains. The question of why it is difficult for citizens of the global north to engage in actions that contribute to long-term social change. So what is it? What are the barriers that are keeping us from engaging in that project of long-term social change? I'll do this by examining three distinct moral motivations that shape the way people respond, people from the global north, to circumstances of tragedy and injustice. And those three are sympathy, responsibility, and mutuality. All humans are moral agents who make a variety of moral decisions every day, almost without thinking. Moral intuition functions as a sort of moral compass that helps people assess what is right or wrong in a given situation. Most thoughtful people recognize that the world in which we live is morally gray. This is often why people on the extreme ends of morally difficult questions like assisted suicide or abortion or globalization tend to find their arguments falling on deaf ears with the majority of U.S. citizens. Most people are able to recognize that there's a moral complexity at the heart of these issues that warrants careful attention. And as they try to make morally difficult decisions about what is right, about what is just. At the same time, most people receive very little training in how to exercise their moral agency. This does not mean that people are not morally reflective, or that they don't have very real and strong visceral reactions to the moral problems that they encounter. In recent years, the stories from Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo prompted thoughtful and productive public conversations about torture and due process, with an normative understanding of what is acceptable behavior with regards to people who are suspected of being enemies of the state. Yet, before people were even able to articulate clear, thoughtful, and rational arguments about why the behavior at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo was immoral, many people who looked at the photos of prisoners being tortured responded out of that moral intuition that such behavior was morally unacceptable. When faced with new moral questions, people often respond automatically out of those visceral moral intuitions that are shaped and formed at the intersection of their social location, their worldview, and their values. As people encounter and consider a wide variety of tragedies and social injustice that mark our world, their moral intuition and subsequent responses can be characterized in a variety of ways. These responses form a continuum of moral agency that ranges from sympathy to responsibility to mutuality. These three categories of moral intuition describe the ways in which contemporary first world citizens respond to social and political crises, as well as natural disasters around the world. Each category reflects distinct worldviews and theological perspectives about privilege, blessing, God, and what it means to be human. These categories describe the attitudes of people of privilege, earned or unearned, and how they think about and interact with people living on the margins of society. The complicity of persons whose actions and inactions support the status quo is a morally significant issue. The fact that most people aren't aware of the exact ways in which their actions are complicit in the exploitation of other people and the planet doesn't make that position morally neutral. So the first category of moral intuition is sympathy. People who act out of sympathy are moved by the pictures that they see on television or newspaper reports about poverty, sweatshops, hunger, disease, climate change, natural disaster. They react with moral indignation and horror to tragic events that sweep our consciousness. They are compassionate people who care about others and feel a deep desire to reach out to them and help them in some way. People who act out of a moral intuition of sympathy often associate their own moral agency or capacity to help or respond with their own privilege. And this help then often translates into writing a check, though it can extend to volunteering at a homeless shelter or even participating in a mission trip to an impoverished area to help work on cleanup after a disaster or all sorts of things. Primarily, people who respond from a moral intuition of sympathy are motivated either by feelings of pity and sorrow for the misfortunes of others, or by the guilt they feel when they judge that their lives are better than the lives of those that they reach out to help. Individuals moved by sympathy might wear a wristband in solidarity with the One campaign to make poverty history, or buy a product red shirt at the Gap to help fight AIDS in Africa, or write a check to a local charity. The emotional connection and feelings that they have for the plight of the victims or survivors of terrorism or HIV or poverty or natural disaster is very real, and their desire to help is genuine. Though it may not be explicitly stated, for people who act out of the sympathy stage of moral intuition, there's a fundamental divide that exists between themselves and the other, who they seek to help. While their sympathies are roused by that immediacy of the news story, or as long as they are looking at the footage of the tragedy in question, this distance that separates them from the other allows them to turn the channel, or to put down the newspaper, or to simply turn away and to go back and continue leading their lives in the same way that they did before they learned about the catastrophe. People who act out of sympathy lack an understanding, or perhaps simply avoid, the systemic factors that have contributed to the social injustice or tragedy that has moved them to act. For the most part, their personal experience of privilege is an assumed part of their life and remains relatively unexamined. Many Christians who act out of this category of moral intuition also share a theological understanding of their privilege, success, or relative affluence as a blessing from God. They thank God for their health, their good jobs, their families, and for the blessing of living in a country where they have the freedom to succeed and thrive. These prayers reveal belief in a potentially dangerous theology of blessing that allows people to understand their privilege as gifts from God. When the origins of this kind of theology can be traced back to Calvinist and puritanical ideas about humility and the beneficence of God. In an increasingly integrated world that is marked by unconscionable disparities of wealth and poverty, this kind of theology implies that the poor people in our world, including whole countries of people, have not been blessed by God. The deeper theological implication is that the people who live in the first world are somehow morally superior to those who live in the two-thirds world. This kind of theology ignores the very real material circumstances of human sin that have created economic injustice through colonialism, imperialism, human trafficking, and greed. While the desire of people who do not wish to seem as if they deserve the many material goods that make up their life might be laudable, a theology that serves to justify their wealth as a gift or a blessing from God creates divine sanction for the social inequality in our world and can function to reinforce an uninformed worldview that explains poverty in the world through the liberal lens of individual responsibility that is foundational to neoliberal economic globalization. So moving on to responsibility, which is the second category. In this stage of moral intuition, people recognize that society is plagued by social problems and that they hold a certain amount of privilege in society. So there's a little bit more self-reflection in those who are working out of a moral intuition of responsibility. Their recognition of these two facts motivates them to help others out of an understanding that their privilege and relative affluence gives them a certain authority and accountability even to care for others who are less fortunate. While they may have some awareness of the historic injustices in our country as they relate to race and gender, many people in this stage are still guided by a deep faith in the principles of liberty and freedom, and they champion individual rights and responsibilities. Equality of opportunity. These are the solutions to inequality. Often they believe that democratic societies have progressed to a place where all people really do have the capacity to change their situation in life if they just work hard enough and make good life choices. This might lead them to work with organizations that focus on providing relief and support to individuals who have experienced misfortune or personal crisis. Sometimes belief in the possibilities that liberty and freedom offer can mask their ability to see the structural aspects of race, class, and gender oppression that function to interfere with people's attempts to help themselves or better their situations. Many people in this stage have developed or are in the process of developing a more critical assessment of globalization. In light of the problems of sweatshops, forced labor, human trafficking, and environmental degradation that they associate with the recent trends in globalization, they do not necessarily buy into the dominant rhetoric that free trade is the solution to poverty in the developing world. They are often very aware of their own complicity in perpetuating these same problems, but are at a loss in imagining ways that they can make a difference in the world. Increasingly, one way in which they are responding is to try to be more accountable with their own purchasing power and to seek out personal lifestyle changes that they can implement, like installing low energy light bulbs, buying local, organic, or fair trade food, or boycotting Walmart or other big box retailers that have reputations for the exploitation of workers domestically and internationally. These kinds of direct actions have the benefit that a certain amount of personal control over one's buying power can offer immediate gratification and satisfaction in an often overwhelming global economy. Yet, while many people who act out of a moral intuition of responsibility are aware that their individual actions won't solve the problems associated with economic globalization, most of them have not yet grasped the kind of worldview shift required by this project of long-term social change. People who work out of a moral intuition of responsibility are part of a deep tradition of privileged people acting benevolently to help those less fortunate than themselves. The danger of acting out of an attitude of responsibility is that it betrays an imbalance of power in the relationship between the two parties that applies that one is responsible and therefore morally good, while the person in need of assistance is in some way irresponsible and consequently morally flawed. The group needing assistance is represented as helpless and lacking agency. When inequality is embedded in theological anthropology, it functions to keep a certain distance between the two parties. This kind of relationship is often referred to as paternalism, in that the economic or social inequality between the two parties sets up a situation of perceived moral or social superiority that hampers genuine social and political solidarity. Like those people in the previous category, most people who act out of a moral intuition of responsibility do so with the best of intentions and a desire to help. However, it's necessary to examine and to try to understand the ways in which our actions may actually contribute to increased inequality and exploitation when we approach the other from a position of responsible paternalism or benevolence. As long as first world people think of themselves as responsible for addressing the problems of poverty, they position themselves as experts in ways that disempower the voices, perspectives, and agency of people living in situations of poverty. From a theological perspective, the inequalities of power, education, resources, and political influence that exist between the wealthy and the poor, be they individuals or nations, defy God's intention for the creation of a world where social justice marks the common life of God's created order. So the final category is mutuality. From a position of mutuality, people act to help others out of an understanding that the well-being of all creation is interdependent. In this new relationship of mutuality, there is a desire to know one another and to develop a relationship of partnership and respect that contributes to the ongoing well-being of both parties. This category of moral intuition offers the possibility of a new way of responding to injustice that focuses on building relationships between people whose lives are marked by social and economic difference and working together to address a social problem. A foundation of respect for other people's worldviews and life experiences allows for people from different backgrounds and social locations to engage one another in a dialogue that can help lead to the development of new solutions to age-old problems. Too often, when people work out of a position of sympathy or responsibility, they think they know how to solve other people's problems. People who work out of a position of mutuality understand that they can work together with others to solve social problems that impact all of them, but they can't solve other people's problems for them. Partnerships based on mutuality demonstrate a capacity for each party to use their strengths and assets to work together toward the common good. A position of mutuality is rooted in a theological anthropology that affirms the goodness of all God's creation and recognizes that all human beings were created in God's image. People who work out of this moral intuition of mutuality reflect a worldview that differs from the dominant focus on individuality and difference, and allows its participants to meet one another as moral equals. Of course, it's difficult to establish relationships of mutuality when discrepancies of income, wealth, education, and other forms of social privilege remain between the two parties. In these situations, moral equality is a philosophical or theological position that can become the basis for building a social relationship of solidarity. As such, it's a different foundational starting point than either sympathy or responsibility. Those who act out of a moral intuition of mutuality do so with a recognition of the capricious nature of human existence, whereby one's country of origin or the class status of one's parents have a far stronger correlation to one's own future than innate intellect or ability. The motivation that comes from a moral intuition of mutuality is cognizant of the social factors of politics and power and wealth and greed that contribute to the creation of structures of society that disproportionately benefit the educated and wealthy classes. An orientation of mutuality is a necessary moral foundation for first world people who desire to develop such relationships as part of a journey to live more faithfully and more justly in the world. Addressing poverty from either the compassion stage or the responsibility stage is ultimately unable to facilitate the larger scale process of transformation necessary to create long-term social change. In either case, the people that are being helped are still viewed to some extent as other. As long as people primarily define their actions as helping others, either out of guilt or responsibility, they fail to recognize the ways in which their own humanity is tied up in the health and well-being of others. As long as theological perspectives about health, wealth, and well-being are rooted in a belief that some people are blessed with abundance and good fortune, they are incapable of recognizing human culpability in creating a world in which people can die of starvation while food rots in fields. As long as people of wealth and privilege continue to view their abundance and prosperity as justifiable compensation or inheritance that they may choose to share with others, rather than the result of social structures that perpetuate inequality, they will remain in positions of power and privilege. As long as individuals do not have to give anything up, or their lives do not have to change, then they're free to enjoy their privileges while assuaging their guilt and consciences with monetary contributions or volunteer time that contributes to short-term solutions for deep-seated structural injustice. Cultivating a moral agency of mutuality encourages people to recognize the core humanity of each individual person and challenges people to examine the structures of society that impoverish people: lack of access to education, insufficient wages, lack of jobs, poor nutrition, health care. Mutuality represents a new way of being in the world that offers first world citizens a foundation for developing an ethic of solidarity as a pathway for living with integrity in a globalizing world, and a model for participating in changing the direction of the world. Each of these categories of moral intuition helps to describe the way in which people respond on that instinctive level to problems of global injustice. But gut reactions are not synonymous with ethical reflection and action. Rather, moral intuitions are merely a starting place. People have the capacity to change and grow as moral agents and to embrace and develop deeper moral, philosophical, and theological resources for helping shape their lives and the structures of the world in harmony with the principles of social justice and sustainability. When people become more skilled moral agents by developing the tools of social analysis and theological reflection, it can improve moral responses to social injustice by focusing those responses on structural changes that lead to long-term social change. These stages of moral agency also offer insight into how to think more critically about community and public policy responses to issues of poverty globally and in local communities. Traditionally, the churches in the U.S. have a much better experience of responding to poverty with charity than justice. Homeless shelters and feeding programs certainly offer essential relief and assistance to local communities in need, but these experiences go a long way toward helping first world Christians feel good without managing to change any of the underlying structures of society that contribute to these problems. The direct service aid that many churches provide is a necessary and important aspect of ministry. However, charity is not synonymous with justice. The biblical vision of social justice calls Christians to seek a transformation of structures in society that will help the human community move towards sustainability and human well-being. While the ethic of solidarity offered in my work is grounded in Christian tradition, it is not an exclusivist position. Religious communities and traditions represent significant sources of values and normative ethical guidance in our world. And it is necessary for people from different religious traditions to dialogue together, to develop pathways for understanding each other and the common problems that we face as a human community. In deliberative democracies, it is important to structure public conversations in ways that allow for the insights and moral contributions from religious communities to become part of the discourse of civil society. An ethic of solidarity offers the possibility for broad-based conversations across multiple lines of difference as people seek ways of working together to build a world that is both sustainable and just.